must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Are you a third-year physical therapy student that excels on tests when you have study guides, checklists, and deadlines? With all of the information available about how to prepare for the NPTE, it's easy to get disorganized and not feel prepared going into the big day. NPTE Prep Success is an online course that provides PT students easy-to-use study guides and step-by-step guidance through the NPTE preparation. To learn more, visit kylericeprep.com. Thank you again all for your continued support, and now for the show. Hey everybody, and thanks for listening to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. This is Brandon speaking, and before we get to today's episode, I wanted to take a moment to share the behind the scenes regarding our coverage of the PT Residency Fellowship issue. At the HET Podcast, we are committed to providing you with diverse perspectives on topics and issues that you care about. We want to inform you about the logistics we encountered when we recorded these series of interviews. You may have noticed that we have had a lack of episodes discussing ABPTRFE's perspective on the change in regulations in fellowships and residencies. Most of our interviews have covered the program's perspective on this issue. I'm going to tell you why. First, we highly recommend that you read all of the available information on both perspectives and consider this issue from all angles. Now, we have provided some resources in our show notes for consideration, so please check those out as well. As for logistics, ABTA policy requires all media, including our podcast, to coordinate interviews with board members or representatives of ABPTRFE through the ABTA public relations team. Now, over the last few months, we have been collaborating with ABTA to feature an ABPTRFE board of director on this very important topic for a podcast episode. We have a date to touch base for scheduling an interview with them in April. Hopefully, we will be able to share their viewpoint through our podcast around that date. I hope this sheds some light on our perspective and content.
Now, for today's episode, I've talked with Mike Puniello, who is a former ABPTRFE board member. Now, before we get into the episode today, I must make this disclaimer as while Mike is a former ABPTRFE board member, his answers and responses on this episode are his personal views and are not representative of the views of ABPTRFE. But without further ado, here's our interview with Mike. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Powen, and today we have actually a very, very special guest to talk about a few things regarding physical therapy. And as today, I am very pleased to welcome Mike Puniello. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Mike is an orthopedic physical therapist with board certification in orthopedics, along with being a fellow of the American Academy. What Mike has also been up to is he's been doing plenty of teaching within MGH, along with numerous CE courses. And currently, he works at South Shore Physical Therapy Associates in Hingham, Massachusetts. He also served as the prior AOMT representative on the ABPTRFE board and is also a site reviewer for Clinical Residency and Fellowship Credentialing Committee. And, you know, Mike, I really appreciate all the service and the things that you've done throughout your career, as I recognize there's probably way more to what you've done from what I had just listed there. So I appreciate that, and I really thank you for what you've done. But before we kind of just dive into the topic here, what are you up to nowadays, and how are things going over there in Massachusetts?
Well, things are going pretty well, and I've been in my private practice since 1983, so still working at it pretty hard. But recently, the last year and a half or so, I've been pretty busy with the AOMT regarding the discrepancy in fellowship standards between AOMT and ABPTRFE. So I'll just talk about that briefly. Joe Donnelly and Cameron McDonald in a previous podcast addressed the issues very well and in detail. So I'll just do a brief summary. I will say, though, that AOMT appointed a task force to do a feasibility study to investigate whether AOMT should take over the credentialing of fellowship programs independent of ABPTRFE. And I am part of that task force as well. So just a summary, AMPT in 94 developed standards to recognize ONPT programs. And in 2001, AMPT and APTA got together, and APTA agreed to do the credentialing of ONPT programs. And the original 8 ONPT programs were then recognized under APTA. APTA agreed to accept the core competencies from AMPT, which were consistent with IFOMT. IFOMT is International Federation of Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapists, a subgroup of WCPT. Under that agreement, AMPT named a representative to the credentialing committee for 2 3-year terms. APTA recognized AMPT as the member organization for IFOMT. In 2013, Bob Rowe, president of AMPT, and Paul Roker, president of APTA, signed a memorandum of understanding between the 2 organizations. And so APTA, who would later have developed into ABPTRFE, would continue to evaluate using the AMPT and IFOMT standards. AMPT would conduct a practice analysis to develop description of advanced specialty practice every 10 years. So real issue came in back in 2016. APTA hired a consultant to do an external audit of ABPTRFE, including standards, definitions of residency and fellowship, and the process for evaluating the programs. So through a structured process, the proposed ABPTRFE quality standards were presented at CSM and open to a public comment period. They standardized the quality standards for all fellowship programs. Initially, it was thought that the programs would be able to transition. Through that structured process, the proposed ABPTRFE standards were presented at CSM and open to a public comment period. So they standardized the quality standards for all fellowship programs. So for instance, the standards are the same for orthopedic manual physical therapy as they are for the upper extremity athlete. So there are significant discrepancies between ABPTRFE and AMPT standards. And just a brief overview. ABPTRFE requires, if we look at the hours, 150 educational hours, 850 patient care hours, and then 150 hours of one-to-one mentoring. 75 of those are in person. Now, AMPT, which is required to follow IFOMT standards, is much more prescriptive. ABPTRFE no longer requires mentoring by a fellow in training. So the total educational hours for ABPTRFE are 300 hours, and on top of the 850 patient care hours. And AMPT requires 500 total educational hours. There are other discrepancies, but those are the main points right now. So as part of this process, ABPTRFE states that AMPT can require further standards, but they won't evaluate it. So it's up to AMPT to evaluate those standards. So AMPT will need to have a separate evaluation looking at the different standards. We'll need to review the educational hours, curriculum separately, evaluate whether the specific educational hours are met. So ABPTRFE evaluation will not distinguish between the hours for theory and practical components of the program. So AMPT will need to review the mentoring portion of the program to evaluate whether the specific mentoring hours are met with regard to the one-to-one mentoring, the fellow mentor, and the fellow in training serving as the primary clinician. So at this point in time, there are 2 different standards for ONPT fellowship programs now in the US, ABPTRFE and AMPT. Currently, there are no programs that are just accredited under ABPTRFE, so all have been working under the AMPT standards. But if and when there are, in my opinion, it's going to pit programs against each other. So the AMPT programs in their marketing, we're going to have to advertise their higher standard and state why that higher standard is more important and better educational component. So I think really that's detrimental to the profession. right now, we should not set up a system where two programs, OMPT fellowship programs, oppose each other. And this is the only fellowship area in the country now that has two different standards. So regardless of whether the Academy stays with ABTRFE or takes over the accreditation, AAMP still needs to establish a review committee and a board to make these accreditation decisions. With the ABTRFE review, AAMP has one reviewer as part of that team, but it should not just fall to one AAMP reviewer to decide whether that program has met the requirements. Another major issue, and that was touched in the previous podcast, was the ABTRFE requirement of residency completion or specialty certification as the prerequisite for fellowship enrollment. Right now, because of that requirement, OMPT programs, many of them don't have enough applicants and are on the brink of closing. So it's obvious this program is premature. There's just not enough of an applicant pool to feed the fellowship programs. And initially, I thought the programs would be able to transition within a year, but that just hasn't happened. It seems that the ABTRFE requirement should be dropped until there are enough residency graduates in the future. Consider this. At this point in time, there are 3,900 graduates of all residency programs within the country. That's a pretty low applicant pool. And that's not even, residency is probably a third of that. Now, I also have an issue with ABTRFE not requiring a fellow to be a mentor. And I just want to describe my experience previously with AAMP. I was chair of the examination committee. And when AAMP was formed, there was a exam and portfolio process developed to recognize experienced therapists who could become a fellow in the academy. So when I was involved with the process, it required an OCS, a portfolio, which included educational experience, mentor experience, and letters of recommendation from 2 physical therapy colleagues and 1 MD colleague. So those who passed the portfolio were then allowed to qualify to sit for the oral practical exam. A number of people, of those candidates, did not pass the portfolio process. And the pass rate for the oral practical exam was 68%. And we conducted 5 or 6 in that time frame. So of those physical therapy colleagues and MD colleagues who recommended these people to take the exam, they weren't able to recognize the qualifications of these people to meet the FAA OMPT standard. If the ABTRFE programs do not require fellow mentoring, they could potentially have less qualified mentors. I think that's going to dilute the practice of OMPT. So at this point in time, there really doesn't seem to be a benefit for AAMP to continue to have ABTRFE accredited OMPT programs, which is why now the feasibility study to look at AAMP taking back that process.
I was just going to kind of add a follow-up to that, because I know you had kind of explained some of the things that Joe and Cameron had mentioned, and also Mark Shepard had kind of talked about from the program's perspective on some of these ABTRFE requirements. And of course, the president of AAMP, Elaine Lyman, recently was on to talk about this a little bit more in detail from the accreditation standpoint and kind of how that would work and kind of the decision-making behind that. And it's certainly not a easy solution. It's certainly complex with a lot of things involved, and I can see certain things on both sides, but but it is interesting, and I hope that at the focus group in April, I hope that everyone's able to come together and move forward together, because I, like you, I don't want to see us separate like this, because
Right.
I feel like once this happens, it's no turning back.
Yeah, so Brandon, now my understanding with that focus group is it's to look at the large programs and discuss the site visits and the number of site visits required. I don't believe they're going to address at all the discrepancy between AAMP and ABTRFE. Fortunately, I don't even think that's on the table.
Yeah. Now ABTRFE did temporarily suspend the site visit requirement. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. that the new requirement was suspended until they get a little better handle on it.
And, Mike, I'm curious because you had mentioned some of the things that you've been involved in, of course, with AMPT, ABTRFE, and a few others as well. I'm kind of curious, just what was your story and how you initially got in? Because everyone, I find, has such an interesting and unique story about how they got involved with the professional association. So let's dive back into that. Let's turn back the clock. What was your story with how you got involved, and even to kind of how it got you more involved with ABTRFE specifically, if you wouldn't mind?
Sure. Well, so I've been involved with AMPT for a long time, probably since the 90s. And I was on the exam committee, as I mentioned, since 01 and became chair in 03. My involvement with APTA on a national level began when I was appointed to SACE, Specialization Academy of Content Experts, as an item writer for the OCS exam. I had a term from 2000 to 2002. Then I became much more involved with the ABTRFE exam process, so I turned all my energies there. My involvement with ABTRFE started, when I was on the faculty at MGH Institute. I was involved in different capacities over about a 20-year period, but I was responsible for developing an orthopedic residency program and credentialing it. We were I think about the 5th orthopedic residency program credentialed in 2003. In 06, the committee to credential programs was just a group of 6 or 8 committee members. So in 06, they put out a call to program directors to join the credentialing review team for residency and fellowship programs because there was so much growth in the program. So when ABTRFE was formed in somewhere around 09, 2010, that's when they established a board as well as a credentialing services council, credentialing services committee. So because of my involvement, then I was asked by Bob Rowe, as president at the time of the AOUT, if I would be the rep on the Credentialing Services Council. And then from there, in order to be a board member, you had to have been on the Services Council. So then I was appointed to the board for term 2013 to 2017. So that's how I got eventually to the ABTRFE board. At this point in time, I'm serving as a program reviewer. As I said, most of my efforts now are with AMPT.
So, Mike, as you kind of had mentioned, of course, being with all the other avenues that you were involved in, of course, being on the ABTRFE board from 2013 to 2017 as that representative to AMPT, I'm kind of curious, would you mind sharing a little bit more background into that process of how ABTRFE was initially created and how it's kind of transformed to where it is now, just to kind of get an understanding of how this whole thing came to be?
Yeah, so APTA initially formed a committee to develop a process to recognize residency and fellowship programs somewhere in the late 90s, 2000. So at that time, there were 8 OMPT residencies that were recognized by AMPT. And I believe they had a couple orthopedic residencies in the works to evaluate. So the committee developed standards and evaluation process, I think using professional organizations as a model. The committee members also served as a resource. They shared documents, consulted informally with potential programs to assist their development. Personally, that was a big help to me in developing the orthopedic residency at MGH Institute. Originally, my intention was to have 2 tracks at the Institute. I wanted to accredit a credential with AMPT as an OMPT program and then an orthopedic residency with APTA. By the time we were ready to credential, they merged and we had to choose one, so we chose the orthopedic track. By the later 2000s, there was much more growth and it became clear that the committee type of structure was not sufficient. So give you an idea, when I was on the council, in the board, there was probably a 30% growth in programs every year. So APTA then formed ABTRFE board in a similar format to ABPTS with a board, a council, and committee. At that time, board consisted of 8 members. Now it's changed. The membership is 10 members with 8 physical therapists and 2 public members. That's changed since I've been on the board. The structure has been modified, and I encourage you to visit the website, www.abptrfe.org, for the specifics. But there's a 10-member board now. There's a 13-member candidacy review committee. There's a 37-member on-site team and 7-member standards committee. The standards committee was established as an independent oversight committee to review the standards with the perspective of implications to programs. And this was in direct response to inquiries, complaints, and feedback from program directors. There is a tremendous infrastructure with APTA, with staff and IT requirements. And we should be aware that ABTRFE is still not budget neutral, and it's still subsidized by APTA. So at this time, there are 264 residency programs and 53 fellowship programs. Of those fellowships, 32 are OMPT fellowship programs.
Yeah, and Mike, you had kind of mentioned, of course, like those different committees and avenues within ABTRFE that kind of help contribute to do what they do, and of course, mentioning the standards committee, but that they review the accreditation standards. But I'm kind of curious in terms of how did they initially come up with these quality standards? Like, what was, to your understanding, where did it kind of all start from, like developing those standards?
Okay, so I wasn't part of it way back then, but there are other professions that have residency and fellowship. Medicine, obviously, optometry, ophthalmology, pharmacy, nursing, nurse practitioners, and then the oversight accrediting bodies, Department of Education and CHIA, they have standards that they look for to evaluate these programs. So I think in talking with people who've been involved way back then, they looked at the other professions as well as the accrediting bodies. Because when you look at the accrediting bodies, USDE and CHIA, a lot of what they have look like the quality standards that are now with ABTRFE.
I'm kind of curious because obviously seeing where ABTRFE has started and how they've gotten to where they are today, what is your understanding of ABTRFE's vision for physical therapy post-professional education? Like, where do you see them trying to take it?
In the recent PT in Motion news, the email from March 6th, there was a section on the Education Leadership Partnership, which was formed with APTA education sections. They were tasked with investigating the future of entry-level progressing to post-professional education. So when I was on the ABTRFE board, we had discussions at that time with the consultant regarding where residency and fellowship was headed, what it would look like in the future. And the discussions went into the future of entry-level progressing to internship, then to residency, either being paid or unpaid, hopefully paid, positions. And the ELP report discusses the potential to have a graduated licensure from internship to residency, then to full licensure. So this could potentially lessen the cost of PT education with paid positions while providing more clinical education and mentoring. So ABTRFE, the APTA board liaison to ABTRFE, brought our discussion to the APTA board, and that led to them charging the ELP to look at that model. And so if professional education goes that path from internship to residency, so ABTRFE is evolving their processes to be prepared if that path becomes reality in the future. Obviously, we're talking many years, 20 plus years. But if professional education goes that path from internship to residency, there needs to be 10,000 or more clinical sites to accommodate that volume. So ABPTRFE is moving toward also external accreditation from organizations such as CHEER, the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, or USDE, the United States Department of Education. I think that all influences the quality standards and board decisions, and I think that's really the vision at this point.
Yeah, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong. One thing I heard is that with getting an accreditation from that, there would be assistance for student loans. Is that true?
Yes, I'm not sure if both would allow that or if just the USDE would allow it, but yes, there was the potential for student loans as well as program development.
Gotcha. And, Mike, of course, knowing that, of course, there are people that kind of are on both sides of this, should residency be the normal continuum, should it not be? But, I'm kind of curious, you mentioning this vision that ABPTRFE has kind of had and what was talked about. Do you foresee ABPTRFE's vision becoming a reality? And what hurdles along the way would you anticipate could happen as this pursuit towards this normal continuum kind of pan out?
Yeah, so it's not just ABPTRFE, but APTA vision as well, if professional education moves in that direction. Obviously, there are enormous hurdles to overcome. First being clinical sites to accommodate the volume. We would need qualified mentors at the internship level and then residency trained mentors at the residency level. Already a lot of programs, DPT programs, have trouble finding clinical sites. So we'd have to really develop that extensively. In order to accommodate that type of volume of students, I think the model of one-to-one supervision and mentoring really would need to change. It could look more like a 1-to-4 model, mentor to student ratio, just to meet that demand. On the ABPTRFE end, there needs to be a tremendous increase in administrative workload, infrastructure, staffing. Just think of the number of program accreditation and reaccreditation that needs to happen. Now there are annual reports, substantive change forms that are evaluated regularly. There would also probably be a higher number of volume of grievances and appeals because of the volume of students. I also think the process of accreditation would need to change with more of a burden on the education programs to evaluate their clinical sites. Consider that CAPTE doesn't require clinics to be accredited, and it's the responsibility of the schools to develop the relationships with the clinics. If the professional education vision really becomes a reality, the current accreditation of residencies could look a lot different than it is today. Residency and fellowship credentialing and accreditation is an evolving process, and that would continue. And looking at it, professional education is always evolving. So when I graduated in 1980, the entry level was a bachelor's degree. Professional education looks much different now. The vision at that time was a master's degree would be required by 1990, and it took much longer for all programs to meet that level. I believe at least to the year 2000. Then in the 90s, there was debate about whether DPT level education should be entry level or post-professional. Obviously, we know how that turned out. Now, all entry-level programs are DPT, and it took a much shorter time to achieve that than it did at the master's level. So I'm sure professional and post-professional education will continue to evolve and look much different in another 40 years. Obviously, I won't be in the profession in another 40 years.
All right, and that's really interesting, because I know that goes into so many other different avenues. I know it's a huge topic, but Mike, I want to go back a little bit, and you kind of had mentioned part of kind of how the ABPTRFE is kind of set up and kind of how it operates with being on the board. But apart from what you've already mentioned earlier, would you mind giving us a little bit of insight into kind of how the process worked with being involved? Like, what were your meetings like? How did information flow between subparts of ABPTRFE? How were things voted on? Like, how did decisions get made? Just to kind of get an understanding of kind of how things work from the inside.
Okay, so yeah, the structure there are 10 board members, like we said, 8 physical therapists from different specialties, and then 2 from the general public. There are 3 meetings a year and then monthly conference calls. The meetings are usually 2 days and with a very packed agenda. Every meeting is different depending on the pressing issues, but quality standards and rules of practice are discussed, reviewed, modified, and different agenda items could include things like promoting research, collaborating with APTA outcomes registry, coordinating issues with ABPTS, those types of things. And then program evaluations, issues, and appeals are decided, as well as grievances from residents, fellows, in training. There are just a few examples of what happens in these board meetings and conference calls. When I was on the board, there were many meetings with the consultant regarding revision of the standards and procedures. As far as receiving correspondence to ABPTRFE, it's received by APTA staff. Kendra Harrington, who's the director, coordinates all that. She coordinates sending the information to the board members, works with the board chair to put the issues on the agenda, conference call meeting, and/or meeting agenda. But in my experience on the board, issues that were brought forward by programs, residents of fellows in training, subcommittees, and AMPT is discussed at the board meeting. There's usually a resolution of those issues either at the time of that meeting or at another meeting. Also, ABPTRFE has a liaison to the APTA board who coordinates and communicates with both boards. As far as decisions, the board votes on issues through discussion. Some issues are referred to APTA legal for clarification. Now, program evaluations by the review team are then reviewed and approved by the board. If there are issues that require a review by the board, it's sent through Kendra, and program appeal decisions and grievance resolutions are made by the board. I have to say that I think it was a really very rewarding experience serving on the board as well as the committees. It's a volunteer organization, very dedicated people whose objective is to advance the profession. You know, I've made good friends and have great respect for those colleagues. Board members, keep in mind, have to consider all of the information that the general physical therapy community might not be aware of because of confidentiality. So they have to take all that into account in making decisions. You know, we can never satisfy everyone, and be assured that the board members are making decisions that they feel are best. Sometimes we're just not happy with those decisions.
Fair enough. And, you know, I'm curious, Mike, because of with you being involved in that avenue, I'm kind of curious, what have you learned about residency and fellowship education from this experience?
You know, I've reviewed many programs in my 11-year or so involvement with the committee, ABPTRFE, and conducted numerous site visits. I'm very impressed with the amount of talent, innovation in the profession, both in the academically and clinically based programs. While the quality standards set by ABPTRFE is structured, it allows programs to be creative in meeting their objectives. The best programs take advantage of the strengths of their faculty and their mentors, so there's much variability in the implementation of programs. For me, that's influenced my practice as well as provided a different perspective when reviewing the programs. I do have to admit, in my experience, there are some that try to take shortcuts or game the system. They're very few, and usually they're recognized quickly and dealt with. But keep in mind, some of the ABPTRFE policies and procedures are made in response to those issues. So, you know, that's some of the confidentiality that, you know, we're just not aware of in the decisions that are made. And I've been off the board now for 2 years, and I really have no idea of the issues that have come up in that time.
Sure. And, and Mike, kind of going down a little bit more, you had mentioned a lot about the pros of how ABPTRFE operates between the structure and everything and on all those different realms. So I don't want to be redundant here, but what are some other pros and even some cons that you've noticed to kind of how ABPTRFE operates as an organization to achieve its mission?
On the pro side, I just said, it's a hardworking, dedicated APTA staff, board members, program reviewers. Without that, the whole process would fall apart. Very committed, and there's a good commitment from APTA to provide the infrastructure and guidance and financial support is excellent. ABPTRFE also provides resources to promote mentoring and program development. You'll find that on their website. There's training for reviewers to create much more consistency amongst reviewers. And it's been sort of a growing pain since they started developing the entire process. But I have to say in my 11 years, the consistency amongst reviewers has improved tremendously. Now on the con side, ABPTRFE on both residency and fellowship side has grown tremendously. With that, there's less flexibility. When there were 10 programs years ago, there was much more flexibility in meeting deadlines, granting exceptions, and that type of thing. Now with 317 programs and growing, as well as planning for the future, there's not much wiggle room with the flexibility. So there's little ability to adapt to feedback from programs regarding the quality standards. The quality standards can be revised every 5 years. On the one hand, that's good because the programs are not constantly responding to changes. But on the other hand, when an issue is recognized and that standard can't be changed for 5 years. And that's some of what we're seeing now with the issues with AOMP's standards. They can't be touched for a number of years with ABPTRFE.
All right. And Mike, kind of just looking at, a different angle other than ABPTRFE for a second, apart from the board experience, of course, you had mentioned earlier being a program reviewer and also a site visitor in the past. I would just be kind of curious just to kind of understand what that process is like and kind of your understanding of that. Would you expand a little bit on that program and site reviewing process to give some context into kind of how that's done, what you're looking for, and kind of some of the big things you're finding with that you did find with that, excuse me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sure. The process is very well documented on the ABPTRFE website under policies and procedures. Now, this has changed considerably since I joined the committee back in 2006. It's much more structured, allows more feedback for program development, and gives the program the best opportunity for a successful outcome. But to summarize the process, the first step is candidacy. There's a workshop and self-evaluation report that's completed 9 to 12 months before completing an application. Once the program applies for candidacy, a review council member is assigned, and that person reviews the report and exhibits and files. They file a accreditation report rubric, and that council member provides feedback to the program to develop policies, procedures, curriculum, and other aspects of the application. So once the program is deemed ready, the report is sent to the ABPTRFE to grant to grant the candidacy status. The board then could also make recommendations for continued improvement. So once candidacy status is granted, it expires in 18 months. The program admits their first participants, and then a site visit date is established by ABPTRFE within 6 to 10 months. The site visit consists of a 3-member team and lasts at least 2 days. A maximum of 5 sites can be visited. And the purpose of the site visit is to assess full compliance with quality standards. The visitors will meet with program director, the director of the sponsoring organization, faculty, and students. Mentoring sessions are observed and evaluated. The report's then sent to ABPTRFE for review, and they decide either to grant accreditation, defer to request more information or to deny the accreditation. And also there's a well-documented appeal process on the website. So if programs are denied candidacy, there is an appeal process to follow.
Gotcha. And, Mike, kind of going off of, maybe stepping a little bit of away from ABPTRFE totally on this one. I know you were the chair of the task force to kind of revalidate the description of specialty practice in orthopedic manual physical therapy. And knowing, of course, how important the description of specialty practice is and kind of what that can influence, what were the biggest updates to the description of specialty practice? And where do you see the updates going? Like, where do you see that changing to in the future? Like, what do you anticipate?
Well, in writing the DASP, we were careful with the language so as not to be limiting of newer evolving areas of practice. Consider how much has changed in the last 10 years. So, for instance, there's much more expansion of dry needling with many more published studies. Look at the use of the pain sciences and use of diagnostic ultrasound, which has greatly expanded. Now there are some states that are moving closer to the military model of physical therapy practice, where physical therapists order diagnostic imaging and prescribe anti-inflammatory medication. So in writing the document, we were careful not to be limiting and to allow for innovation. There's also been a change in the language from evidence-based to evidence-informed. And while that might sound like semantics, it's really important. In the past, some in the profession have had the philosophy that, evidence-based practice consisted of following prediction rules and decision-making algorithms. But that was never the intent of Sackett's model of evidence-based practice. Sackett's model had 3 equal components: the patient with their beliefs and biases, the clinician with their training, clinical experience, and decision-making, and the third equal component was the evidence. So the wording change to evidence-informed really more closely captures the current practice, but it also allows for incorporation of emerging evidence into clinical decision-making while still maintaining it autonomous practice. And the DASP is valid now for 10 years, and that's the basis for the standards for ONPT programs. So we wanted to be descriptive, but not prescriptive. So allowing for incorporation of other areas of, that have expanded over time.
Interesting. I mean, because I can only imagine how much of a task that must be to really look at all these data and look at all this stuff to kind of figure out how to update that. Like, I can only imagine how expansive that must have been and how tedious that was.
Yeah, there is a practice analysis in a survey sent to fellows in the academy to get their input on the areas that are still valid in practice. So that whole practice analysis was conducted with surveys. We had a 60-something percent, 64 or so percent response rate on the surveys, which was very good as far as revalidation survey. Most considered 30% a good response rate.
Gathering that's gathering surveys from a lot of the fellows, of course, I'm assuming newer fellows and current fellows. Do we sometimes run the risk of getting a similar perspective or point of view that's perpetuated a lot rather than being more updated?
Yeah, no, that's not a bad question. So what really you're asking is, are these fellows just following what they were taught in their fellowship programs, and that has to remain? My philosophy in education, and I know a lot of people have the same philosophy, and in these ONPT programs they do. My philosophy has always been, give them the current information, give them the tools and decision-making processes to then expand. I would be extremely disappointed if someone practices in 20 years the way I taught them to practice, at that time. What gives me the most satisfaction is seeing former students branching out and teaching and research and, expanding on what we gave them. The education level should give them a basis to then develop from. So what you brought up, your point of, are they just responding to what they've been taught? Some maybe, but I think a lot have, really expanded, and that's what we're seeing. There was one study that was put out, Julie Whitman and some of the others,
Right.
Yeah, comparing residents to fellows.
Right, the Rodagero study.
Yeah, Jason Rodagero,
Mhm.
right. And, the fellows performed much higher than residents and had better outcomes. And the residents had similar outcomes to the experienced physical therapists. And that doesn't really surprise me, because when I started in the profession, there were no residencies, there were no fellowship programs. So we developed our own clinical ed track based on, we chose continuing education courses. We chose to work with mentors, work in a facility where we could be mentored. And so we progressed, and, we became fellows in the academy by portfolio and exam processes. So it doesn't surprise me that experienced physical therapists would perform similarly to residency grads. Residency grads, for the most part, are less experienced, just newer grads. So that doesn't surprise me at all. I am encouraged, though, by the fact that the fellows performed at a higher level, and that's what you'd expect, because people have gone from that entry level to experience or residency level and now expanded to a fellowship level. So I think, I was really encouraged to see that. It was a small study, so I forget how many fellows were involved, but, we'd like to see many more of those studies. And I know ABPTRFE would like to see many more of those studies, and they're willing to, share data that they have. And I know they're working with some people now to share that data.
Well, that's really good, because I also hope that we can have more research on this, because I know this is something that we really don't have much research on at all. So I think getting more studies and looking even some different facets would be very, very beneficial to kind of answer some questions here. And Mike, I want to take the time to say thanks again for sharing your perspective, because I've definitely learned a lot about ABPTRFE and kind of how that all worked. And we'd like to finish every episode with our finale questions. This is kind of our big cheese, as you will. And if you want to mention something you said earlier or bring up something that's totally different, that's completely fine. But the question is, if you could change one aspect of healthcare education, whether that be DPT or other healthcare provider related, which aspect would you change, and how would you change it?
Well, I think providing more education, clinical education, is essential. And personally, I like the model of, DPT to internship to residency as a path for full licensure. I think this would shift more of the clinical education and decision-making to the place where the student sees the patient and they could integrate that information with their clinical experience and mentoring. And as I said already, I think the physical therapy profession is a long way off from that vision. Also, I think we need to be open to innovation and technology in both entry-level and post-professional program development, as well as with accreditation. You look at what's happening now, there are a few new programs offering hybrid entry-level DPT programs with online content and on-site labs. We did that at the post-professional level at MGH Institute back in, mid-2000s maybe. I had 4 post-professional programs, and we developed that into hybrid format, and that works pretty well. I think there are some students who still like to have a face-to-face instruction in the school settings, but I think using more technology is a good way to go. I think we'll see much more of that in the future. When I was at MGH Institute, back in the early 90s, the IT department was developing an online education platform. And they came to the faculty and asked, what would you like us to build into the system? And how do you want to utilize the system? So our response, this was in the late 90s, is we don't even know what the possibilities are. There weren't many online education platforms at that time. So they had to teach us about the technology before we could even think about how to use it. So I think when accrediting bodies are writing standards, they should really try to incorporate language that promotes and not limits that innovation. Because there's so much out there, we don't even know what's coming down the road.
No, that's a really interesting answer, Mike. And I think we've heard such a diverse number of responses and ideas and suggestions from this final question about so many topics of healthcare education. So that's something we always appreciate. And I really, really liked your response there. Well, Mike, I know you had mentioned, of course, the ABPTRFE website, APTA, and a few others as well. But where else can people kind of look online, or even just find out, or where else can they look to kind of just find out any more information on this? Or should they have a question and perhaps want to reach out?
Well, yeah, I think both those websites, abptrfe.org and aaompt.org, and also the APTA website, I think would be good. I think people can look individually at the different OMPT program websites. They might have some information. I'm happy to provide my email if anyone has questions. It's mpuniello, mpuniello @AOL.com. And you can laugh at me for still using AOL. That's how tech savvy I am. But I think some of those are good websites.
Well, perfect, Mike. And so to all you who are listening, go ahead and just scroll down and look at the show notes, as all those links are right there if you want to check them out. But Mike, again, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for your service and all that you've done. Keep up the great work. And, it's always a pleasure, man.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Access to healthcare is one of the largest issues facing both providers and patients, as millions of people worldwide lack timely and affordable access to healthcare. Anywhere Healthcare, a telehealth platform, is a simple, low-cost option for providers and patients that eliminates the barriers to access to all kinds of healthcare. To find out more, check out anywhere.healthcare, which is available in our show notes. And if you use the code HET in all caps when you email to sign up, you'll save 25% off the total cost. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter @HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.